In late 2020, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas made a decree saying on May 22nd parliamentary elections would be held, that on July 31st there would be presidential elections, and on August 31st there would be an election of the Palestinian National Council. Somehow, Fatah, Hamas, and all the other Palestinian factions came together and decided they would have these elections. This decision came after the Abraham Accords, where the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco all decided to normalize relations with Israel. They all did this for a variety of reasons, whether their own or for geopolitical interests or otherwise. The attempt to annex part of the West Bank sent the PA into a spiral of worry and insecurity. Abbas was in a position where he needed legitimacy, which forced his hand to start having elections. Palestinian democracy has always struggled to get off the ground, but in some form or another it has existed. When you examine Palestinian elections, you begin to notice a trend. The attempt to control and subvert this democracy has continuously surprised and irritated its observers and participants. The perpetrators and the actors within this history have not learned their lesson, and they will continue to fail, and they will continue not only to ruin the prospects of Palestinian democracy, but sabotage any good outcomes for themselves. Of course, I'm speaking about Israel and Fatah. Israel's decision to interfere with the Palestinian elections in 2021, where they decided that the best course of action is to threaten and bully the Palestinians to stop having elections, has failed. Now it is too late to stop these elections. Too much political capital has been spent by the Palestinians not to have them. By insisting on being obstructionists, they only serve to hamper their own interests. Fatah, on the other hand, has failed at providing an alternative as a good governing body, and has begun to fall to pieces, thus assuring that they will struggle in these elections. In 1974, Arafat spoke in front of the UN, giving the Palestinian nationalist movement international legitimacy. With elections coming up in 1976 for the municipal elections, Israel thought it could use this as an opportunity to destroy the political legitimacy of the PLO by supporting the pro-Jordanian mayors. According to their own internal records for municipal elections, the PLO would only get about 1/3 of the vote. You would think that this clear majority would give them nothing to worry about, but they still took measures to influence the election because they were extremely paranoid. They decided to expel pro-PLO candidates from the West Bank. The heavy-handed removal of people that the Palestinians were supposedly to have a choice to rule them didn't sit well with Palestinians. So, they protested. This resulted in a resounding success of pro-PLO candidates in the West Bank, who rode this wave of protest into office. Coming into the current elections, where Fatah begins to fracture into different groups, many Americans might wonder why Hamas is the most cogent party currently running. But things were not always this way. Before the first Intifada, the first uprising against Israeli occupation, the Islamic movement was more peaceful. This was how the Israelis saw it, at least. After the Palestinian municipal elections, Israel had their own elections, where the Likud took power in 1977. Settlement increased, and the Israelis were looking for a moderate leadership that would serve as a valve in order to release the resentment for these policies away from nationalistic struggles against the occupation. The idea was that if the younger generation was turned towards religious activities, this would decrease the interest into nationalist activity. At the time, nationalist activity was more scary than religious activity. This was based on the fact that before the first Intifada, the Islamist groups were involved in less acts of resistance than the secular ones with communist leanings. Islamic groups were less organized. But then the first Intifada happened, and Hamas was formed. In 1987, Israel's greatest threat within the occupied territories was formed, and part of that was due to Israel's meddling. For the next 20 years, Hamas would boycott elections, skipping the 1996 elections, where Yasser Arafat won overwhelmingly. In 2004, Yasser Arafat died, and Mahmoud Abbas was elected as his replacement in 2005. Many Israelis and pro-Israeli Americans have certain views on Mahmoud Abbas, that he is a dictator, that he is corrupt, that he is nepotistic, that he is selfishly holding on to power, and that the PA that he runs is a corrupt bureaucracy. Something that these same people fail to consider is that this is also something that Palestinians themselves believe. In a recent poll, Palestinians were found overwhelmingly in favor of Mahmoud Abbas resigning. Corruption has always been something that has plagued Palestinian politics. In 2006, the problem of corruption was a serious issue. By then, 60% of the government's expenses went to pay PA salaries, and more Palestinians began to notice this corruption. In 2001, 74% believed Fatah to be corrupt. In 2005, it was 86%. Fatah had also failed to address serious economic issues. The unemployment rate went from 12% to a third of the population. The GDP dropped by 30%, and 43% of the population was impoverished. Mahmoud Abbas is worth $100 million. Fatah also failed in the peace process. As casualties from the Intifada mounted and the peace process looked all but dead, Fatah's emphasis on a two-state solution did not excite voters. From the perspective of Palestinians, Fatah's negotiations with Israel had failed to secure an independent Palestinian state. In the face of increasing Israeli settlements and roadblocks, Fatah's efforts looked counterproductive. Moreover, when Israel withdrew from Gaza in the summer of 2005, a PCPSR poll showed that only 11% of Palestinians attributed the disengagement to Fatah's diplomacy, whereas 40% credited Hamas with their most pressing concern. Out of this 9%, close to 70% voted for Fatah, but this proved not nearly enough. You see, when you call yourselves the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and you fail to liberate Palestine, people are going to think that you are sort of useless. Even today, Palestinians rank ending the occupation as their top priority, and consistently failing at this made them turn on Fatah. People in Fatah knew this, and internal divisions soon came to front. Disgruntled Fatah officials attacked polling locations, and people lashed out against the old guard. Truckloads of independents had joined the race. The leftist parties became irrelevant as they didn't have the USSR to help with their funds. All Hamas needed was a plurality to win. In this environment where Fatah was coming apart and people were suffering economically, Hamas entered the political stage. It is interesting then that they rebranded themselves as the Change and Reform Party. They paid serious attention to the economic issues in their campaigns. They focused on zakat, a form of Islamic charity, in order to drive voters to come out. One spokesperson said, "How can we promise Jerusalem and the right of return when we can't deliver our people a loaf of bread?" Somehow, the radical jihadist Islamist party of Hamas figured out that it's the economy. Stupid. When Hamas won the election with 74 seats and everything was going smoothly for Hamas, the sham collapsed. America and the EU cut ties with the PA, assets were freezed, and Hamas and Fatah struggled for power in Gaza. The resulting power struggle left Hamas in charge in Gaza, and the emergency government headed by Abbas in charge of the West Bank. Now our elections are once again around the corner. We learned that a Fatah that is united can vanquish their foe, Hamas, and still lead the government. Let's see how Fatah is doing right now. It's collapsing. Wonderful. Fatah has not learned their lesson, that people don't want to vote for the kleptocratic regime that has been stealing from them for the past 40 years. People have left Fatah in order to have their own independent lists that might fracture the vote, giving Hamas the plurality of votes once again. People are challenging Fatah from in the party, from out the party, and even from prison. Marwan Barghouti has decided to come after Abbas's stranglehold on Palestine from a jail cell in Israel. Needless to say, things are looking pretty hectic. Israel's response to the idea that Hamas might win has been to jail its leaders in the West Bank and to threaten Palestinians with reprisals should Hamas win. We know how that has worked out before. When you live in a society where democracy and self-determination is dangled in front of you like a carrot on a stick, only to be yanked away whenever you get close, you're going to do what you can to rebel.